that we are able to share this for anyone who planned to attend and wasn't able to, or just wasn't able to at all and wants to watch this later. So thank you everyone for joining. I am Brianne Fisher with the City of Richmond Office of Sustainability, and you are currently in the third of 4 RVAgreen GAB virtual events. So this is a weekly series of events we're hosting throughout the month of April for Earth Month to introduce people to RVAgreen 2050, which I'll talk a lot more about in just a minute, and provide more information on how you can get involved and provide feedback. And it looks like Rob is in. Awesome. Hey, Rob, thanks for joining. So what we're going to do is I'll talk for maybe 5-10 minutes. Then we're going to turn it over to our amazing panelists who have been along this RVAgreen 2050 journey with us for a while now, and hear from them about their experience and what they're doing on the ground. And then we're going to open it up to everybody else who's here for questions, updates, and then we'll wrap up probably by 6 o'clock or so with a call to action for you. So let me share my screen just so we have a few visuals to go along with what I'm saying. All right, so RVAgreen 2050. This is the City of Richmond's Equity-Centered Climate Action and Resilience Planning Initiative. I'm going to go through some of the basics about why we are even talking about climate change today. Obviously, it is Earth Day, and you all are here, so I'm assuming this is mostly going to be a review for you, but just in case. Climate change is the long-term average weather pattern, and we're seeing a shift in it. And this is being caused by our activities here in Richmond and around the world. We are burning fossil fuels to do lots of things, and those fossil fuels, the greenhouse gas emissions from them, are causing our climate and our weather patterns to change. This is just showing in a little bit more detail the sort of cycle that we see. So the greenhouse gas emissions that cause climate change are coming primarily from the energy sources that we use to power our electric grid and our buildings, from the vehicles that we drive and use for transportation, and from the waste that we generate. Those greenhouse gas emissions are producing a warming of our atmosphere, which is having all kinds of impacts, both around the world and here locally in Richmond, which we'll talk about. The impacts that we're most concerned with here are related to temperature and precipitation and flooding. So we'll get into more of that in just a second. Like I said, we're seeing this right here in Richmond. So climate change is not just in the future, it's already happening. Jeremy Hoffman can speak a lot more and much more eloquently to all of this than I can, but just generally, we're already seeing warmer temperatures, we're seeing more storms, we're seeing more dangerous weather, we're seeing earlier and more intense pollen seasons, which is affecting people with things like respiratory illnesses. And these are just a few examples that we've collected over the last few years. We've been working on RVAgreen 2050 of some of the local impacts that we're seeing in our area. So there are 2 primary components to RVAgreen 2050 in terms of the topics that we're focusing on. The first one is climate resilience, and this is looking at climate change and what it is doing to our weather patterns and how those weather patterns are affecting the different systems that we rely on in our community. So like I said, what we're seeing is generally higher temperatures, more heat waves, more dangerous temperatures. We're seeing more precipitation, less as snow, more as rain, and that is contributing to more flooding, both river flooding as well as localized sort of neighborhood flooding, and more dangerous storm events. And then we're also seeing some impacts to the James River from the rising sea level of the Atlantic Ocean and the Chesapeake Bay. And all of these impacts and climate shocks can produce risks for any of the systems that we depend on a daily basis, from our government to our healthcare system and public safety, education. And so what we're looking at with climate resilience is how can we address those risks and impacts and shocks and make our community more resilient to them through different types of strategies. And this is, again, from Jeremy Hoffman, his research and his help in collecting data on what we're seeing here in Richmond, just a little bit of a, sort of preview of what we might expect over the coming decades. So, like I said, it's going to get hotter. We're going to see more dangerous heat, both in terms of hot days and more heat waves. And then we're also going to have more frequent, stronger precipitation events as well, which can lead to flooding. So the other side of the climate change coin is climate action. And this is looking at the sources of the greenhouse gas emissions that are causing all of these climate impacts and how we can reduce those to slow the effects and eventually stop the effects, hopefully, of climate change. So last year, the mayor and city council adopted a goal of reducing Richmond's greenhouse gas emissions community-wide by 45% by 2030, and then to achieve a 100% or net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. And you can see, based on the blue line, that we are seeing a reduction in greenhouse gas emissions since we started tracking our emissions back in 2008. And the RVAgreen 2050 action plan that we'll be talking about today is going to get us to that 2030 goal. So our greenhouse gas emissions here in Richmond, and this is community-wide, so including government operations as well as all of our residents and businesses within city limits, you can see that the majority of our greenhouse gas emissions right now are coming from the sources of energy that are powering our buildings. And then about a third or so of the emissions are coming from transportation sources, with much smaller proportions coming from solid waste and other processes related to water and wastewater. So that is just my quick overview. Now we'll get into what is RVAgreen 2050. So this was announced by Mayor Stoney as an initiative back in 2017. It is an integrated climate action and resilience planning initiative. So we're looking not just at how we can reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, but how we can prepare for the impacts of climate change, because this is a global issue. And around all of that, we are centering equity, and particularly racial equity. So I'll talk more about that in a second. There are many different pieces going into this process, between the different sort of topic areas that we're going to be talking about today, as well as the capacity building that we've been doing in the Office of Sustainability. We've been working with several different working groups of stakeholders, some of whom we have with us today and we'll hear from. And then we also are doing, research into best practices from other cities and all kinds of other tools and resources that can help us produce this first climate action plan for the city of Richmond. So on the equity piece, this is really this at the center of this planning process, as well as the RVAgreen 2050 initiative itself. And this is because we know that both here in Richmond locally, as well as around the country and around the world, climate change is affecting and is going to continue to affect some people differently than others. So you can imagine, those with more resources, more access to assistance, those sorts of things are going to be less impacted by some of those climate shocks that I talked about, like flooding, like dangerous heat. What we're seeing is that the people who face these increased risks are in those situations because of a set of root causes that really, for many cases, comes down to race. And this is especially true of a city like Richmond, where in the last, throughout our history as a city, We have seen so many racist policies and programs that have influenced where people are living in our city today. And that directly relates to the kinds of investments that different neighborhoods have gotten over the years, and the extent to which those neighborhoods are able to deal with the changes that we're seeing in our weather patterns. And so, again, both here locally as well as around the country, we see that over and over. If you take look at the data, you see that lower income residents, as well as people who are identify as Black and African American and Hispanic and Latino and other communities of color, are more likely to live in areas that are experiencing things like extreme heat and flooding, and less likely to have access to things like energy efficient housing and convenient transportation options that produce less pollution and that sort of thing. And so for these reasons, we are focusing on equity, and particularly racial equity, within the RVAgreen 2050 initiative. And as part of that work, one of the first things that we did in our planning process, this was last summer for the most part, is trying to make sure that this plan, although it is about climate change, is relevant and is useful to everyone, no matter what their priorities, their challenges, and what they're looking for from the perspective of better quality of life might be. So we went out to the community and particularly tried to partner with community groups that are trusted voices in the communities that are on the front lines of climate change, and asked about, just what are your priorities? What are your challenges? What are the things you're looking for from city government in general, not even related to climate change? And we heard lots of things, and we sort of distilled those down into 7 community priorities. And we are working to have these community priorities play a central role in the development of the climate action plan, so that we can achieve as many co-benefits as possible. And again, just make this plan more relevant for people, more useful for the community, and have more community buy-in and ownership, hopefully, in both the process and the plan itself. And you can go to our website, which I'll provide towards the end of today's event, to learn more about each of these areas as well. So, where are we in the process? Like I said, this initiative, RVAgreen 2050, was announced back in 2017. We spent a couple years really building our capacity as the Office of Sustainability to do this initiative ourselves, to produce this plan in-house. So we have a team of now 6 people, and we are all working on this initiative in different ways. I'm joined today by a couple of my colleagues, Kyla Logan and Dawn Alexi, and maybe any others who have joined, since I haven't been looking at the participants list. And together we are working on all of these components. As I mentioned, last year was really about understanding community priorities. And then this year, we've really launched into the process to develop this first action plan, which will get us to 2030. The idea being that after that, we will update the plan every 5 years. So right now, we are at sort of a stopping point or a milestone in our process where we've been working with our key stakeholder groups, which consists of 5 topical working groups, which I'll talk about in a second, as well as our Racial Equity and Environmental Justice Roundtable, which is a group of folks from different neighborhoods across the city who are being paid for their time and lived experience expertise to help us center equity in our process and the plan. So we've been working with those groups to develop some draft content in terms of objectives and strategies for this first climate action plan. And now we are bringing it out to the community throughout this month of April to get your input. So that's where we are right now. And then what we'll be doing for the rest of this year is taking all that community input we're getting now, refining the strategies. We will have another round of community engagement towards the fall. So this will not be the last time that you will see this. that we will ask for your input this year. And then in spring, early in 2022, we will be working internally to put together the actual plan document itself. We'll come back out to the community with that document for another round of input and feedback. And then our goal is to have it adopted by the mayor and city council by Earth Day of 2022. So 1 year from today, hopefully we will be having an in-person event where all of you will be in attendance and we'll be celebrating the adoption of RVAgreen 2050. All right, so why should you participate? Well, you're already here, so I'm assuming you have some very good reasons already, but we really need your input. We need input from the entire community on how we should address climate change here, both in terms of becoming more resilient to the impacts we're already seeing, as well as reducing pollution, all of which can have benefits for community health, both mental and physical health, as well as economic benefits and a number of others. So we want to get as many voices to participate as possible, and this is just one of the ways that we're offering an outlet to do that. So getting into the plan itself, and I'll be transitioning to our guest speakers. The content that we have out right now for public input, review and feedback, consists of a vision for RVAgreen 2050, which is that all Richmonders, regardless of their identity or neighborhood, thrive in a climate resilient and climate neutral community. Within that vision, we have two main sort of overarching goals for the whole plan, which is to achieve greenhouse gas emissions reduction, again, 45% reduction by 2030 and net zero by 2050. At the same time, we want to be improving the community's resilience to the climate impacts I talked about, heat, precipitation, and flooding primarily. The content itself of the plan right now is divided into 5 pathways, and these pathways correspond to the working groups that we've been working with. So we have buildings and energy, community, environment, transportation and mobility, and waste reduction and recovery. And then we have our 7 community priorities, which are cross-cutting across the entire plan. And we want to bring those into as many strategies as possible. And I've talked about those a few minutes ago, so I won't repeat myself there. So the focus of tonight's RVAgreen Gab, we've been doing these based on the different pathways within the RVAgreen 2050 draft plan so far. Tonight we're focusing on 2 areas in honor of Earth Day. So we're looking at community and environment. The community pathway is all about, as you could probably guess, people. So the 2 objectives within community are to ensure that historically disinvested communities, which are also those most impacted by climate change, are centered in the process for developing this plan and any solutions that are a part of this one and subsequent plans when we go to update RVAgreen 2050, and that throughout all of these initiatives and efforts, we are using equitable community engagement and communication strategies. And then the other objective within the community pathway is to increase our community's social resilience to climate change. So this is a set of, within this objective, we have a set of strategies around things like how can we increase community cohesion when it comes to safety during severe weather events. For example, if we have a heat wave coming up, do we want to maybe implement a program where people check on their neighbors to make sure that they have access to either air conditioning or they know where a cooling center is or something like that, those sorts of strategies. And then the other pathway we're focusing on is environment. So this one is all about the natural environment. The objectives within this pathway relate both to the access to the environment. So we want to make sure that all residents have the opportunity to engage with the natural environment. So this is both physical access as well as engagement opportunities, for example, when there's a new park coming online, engaging the community around that park to make sure that it has, features that people want to see that they'll actually use. And then also providing information about all of the amazing natural resources that are found right here in Richmond, from the James River to other features, natural species and habitats and that sort of thing. And then the other part of the environment pathway is to use sort of natural strategies or engage the natural environment in helping us to be more resilient to climate change. So this is, looking at things like planting trees and increasing green space to cool down the neighborhoods that are the hottest during heat waves. This could be implementing stormwater infrastructure such as plantings and other strategies to reduce impacts from flooding. Then we can also look at how the natural environment can help to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, such as, again, tree plantings that can absorb carbon dioxide and that sort of thing. So those are the two areas that we're focusing on tonight. Now I am going to stop talking. I realize that took longer than expected. So we have three amazing members of our RVAgreen 2050 working groups with us tonight that have been part of this RVAgreen 2050 process in different ways since it started, really. And what I'm going to ask is that each of them just kicks us off with a quick introduction of yourself, your role, and then anything you would like to share with the group about your experience on one of the RVAgreen 2050 working groups, as well as maybe some information about what your organization or department is working on the ground in some of these areas. Because as we know, that we're working on a sort of longer term planning initiative, but there's a lot of stuff happening in our community on the ground that people can get involved in right now. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and invite you all to unmute, and we'll just go Giles and then Rob and then Jeremy. And then we're going to open it up to the whole audience to ask questions, submit comments for a little while, and then we will wrap up.
Sounds good. My name is Giles Harrison. I'm hearing just like, okay, it stopped. Woo! I work at the Parks Department for the City of Richmond. I haven't been at the Parks Department for very long, and previous to that, I was with Groundwork RVA, and previous to that, I was with Storefront for Community Design. So my background is oriented towards grassroots solutions to some of our systemic problems in Richmond. I love working at the Parks Department because it puts me in touch with community members who are the source of a whole lot of knowledge about our city. I was born and raised in this city, and that affects my relationship with the city and with what we try to do here, because it's all, I think for all of us, it's personal, but the city is something that we need to care for, and that also needs to care for us back. And we have a long way to go to get to that point where the city is as a physical place is really providing the environmental services that we need it to. So I was excited to be a part of RVAgreen 2050. My experience on our community working group has been really informative. I've been really impressed with the sustainability office and the centering of race at the outset of the whole conversation about environmental justice as relates to greenhouse gas reduction, but also increasing resilience. But anyway, those can be very technical topics, I think. And with the sustainability team, you guys have said from the beginning, the status quo wasn't working for Black and Brown residents in this city. And that's something we all know, but so rarely is centered in our processes of making any sort of plan. So it's really thrilling to see that, and also to work with Virginia Community Voice as a part of this process. So Virginia Community Voice really centers listening and an iterative approach to these ideas that we have about how we're going to build resilience in our community. So it's been the kind of process that I've been excited to see unfold and be a part of, and really impressed that it's gone on during COVID. So hats off to you guys. And what we're doing in the community is two things at Parks and Rec and in my sphere, and that's workforce development, which I feel really passionately about. A lot of folks in the city have been left out of decision-making processes in their community, and workforce is a program where the underemployed or unemployed or re-entering residents coming out of incarceration can get job skills, and those job skills relate directly to restoring green spaces in the city. So I feel really passionate about that program. And then we do a lot of volunteer engagement. And I think that's really life-giving. And I would just encourage anybody who has not volunteered. It seems cheesy. It's like we almost need a new word for volunteer, but it's really life-giving. You would be surprised at how good it feels to get to know your neighbors in a park. We'll be doing a lot in the new parks in Southside coming up this year. So there's a lot to be done, and so that's what we have going on.
Awesome. Thanks, Giles. I'll turn it over to Rob.
Teams and I don't always get along. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
All right, wonderful. Groundwork RVA. So Giles just sort of laid out a lot of things that matter for us at Groundwork RVA. I'd say we are really committed and dedicated to making sure that young people of color have access and points of entry into the green world, that their voices are heard, and that the communities that they come from are actually benefiting from the work of sustainability and anything that has to do with greening the city, et cetera, et cetera. I've been lucky to be sitting around the table with Brianne for quite a while, and actually really want to highlight and take hats off and give you specifically, Brianne, kudos for having implemented a process which is very much connected to community. We do processes and planning processes. Richmond 300 was good, right? In the scheme of things, in the scheme of processes that Richmond has undertaken, it wasn't bad. But this is a whole different animal. Before I came to Groundwork, I was an independent consultant, and I did a lot of work, not in Richmond, but in other places, around community engagement and around how to make sure that actual community voice and priorities were heard. And one of the best practices in that process, when it's done well, is to support community members and to give them the ability to sit at a table and not assume that they can volunteer, because everybody can't volunteer. Many people need to be paid for their time. They need to have child support, et cetera, et cetera. And you all have taken that and really expanded it. I mean, when you kind of glossed, and I'm not, you kind of glossed over the fact that those community folks are in decision-making roles, that the work that we do in our environmental committee, all of the experts come through, but it has to go through that community process first to make sure that it actually hits. So I have been just very, very pleased. My hope and prayer is that this process with this equity lens and focus is understood throughout the city and throughout actually the region, and that as people start talking about community engagement, they do things much more akin to this than what we have often done, which is kind of, oh, yes, you're in the community. Okay, we're done. Let's go. All right. So there's that on the environmental thing. I don't want to take up too much time, but I do want to say that Black and brown communities in this town have been overlooked, underserved, underinvested in, not just for decades, but for centuries. And this moment when community voice and young people's voices who come from those communities are actually being solicited, heard, and those of us who know how important it is to have them drive processes are being given platforms. That's a wonderful thing. And it's really, it's happening across the country, and we know that, we're in the middle of a reckoning, and we have a president now who talks about systemic racism, which is like, who expected that? But we do, because it's time. And so as executive director of Groundwork RVA, which has been dedicated to doing this work, Giles was in the seat for a long time and running uphill. And, I happened to get here at a time when we were in position to grow. It's an amazing time. And our young people are benefiting, and our communities are benefiting, and there's a lot of work to do. And processes like this are helpful. So it's been really good to be at the table and be able to kind of say, well, you might want to think about doing it this way, and not have people tell me that I'm stupid, but rather say, oh, yeah, that makes sense. So anyhow, I'll stop talking.
Awesome. Thank you, Rob. I'm just
Unless you're going to let Jeremy talk, at which point then I'll talk.
We got to go to Jeremy now. Just kidding.
Sorry, I couldn't resist.
I was wondering if you were going to close with a joke about me, or if I had to open with a joke about you, Rob. So I'm glad that it was this way around. Good evening, everybody. I'm Jeremy. I'm the chief scientist at the Science Museum. And as Brianne mentioned, I've been kind of like the data guy for a long time, and really interested in understanding more and more about how the climate stressors that the whole world is experiencing are uniquely and acutely felt by communities here in Richmond. I will say that, having the help and collaboration of people like Giles, Bob, and Brianne over the last several years has been, so critical to producing the kind of information that we have for this process. And I think from the scientist perspective, having the information that we've been able to co-create with many of the community organizations that we work with, and have that actually be included and reflected in the process, has been hugely important to making this really actionable. And I think Richmond and the information and the data that we have around Richmond is unparalleled in the rest of the country. I think we are really leading. I have the fortunate opportunity to work with a lot of different cities on these urban heat island campaigns that we started here in 2017. And, we are light years ahead of so many places that are just now even thinking about, it can be hotter in one place than another, And so I'm really fortunate that the science information is valued in this process as well. And I will echo what Rob and Giles have said, that the community voice is valued equally among the information. And so, if not more importantly, and I think that that's really what sets our work apart, and why I'm so proud to be a part of it, and to, call everyone that's on this panel with me my colleague.
Awesome. Thank you, Jeremy. Thank you all so much for your contributions and participating tonight. So now we are going to open it up to the whole group. Does anyone have any questions for our panelists, questions for me about the RVAgreen 2050 process. I am going to be wrapping us up once we're done with what our call to action is. So stay tuned for that, but I'll just open it up to the group for any questions or comments now.
I have a question.
Yes, go for it.
So in one of the early slides, you showed that a lot of the greenhouse gas emissions are coming from building emissions. So I'm not really sure exactly what those building emissions are, but I know since COVID-19, the use of buildings has changed. So I'm just curious if there's any new data that can teach us anything about what we should be doing as a result of the pandemic.
Awesome, good question. And maybe Jeremy, I might, I'll talk a little bit about.
No, I don't think we should. He's smiling too much. Don't let him answer.
I'll talk a little bit about the cities, the data that we have, and then Jeremy would love your input on this. So the data I was showing is from the 2018 greenhouse gas inventory for the community. The emissions within the building sector are from the actual energy sources that are being used to power the electric grid that then powers, that powers our buildings. So that's where we've actually seen a little bit of a decrease in time over the years that we've been tracking this, because of the transition away from, for our electric grid, away from sources like coal towards things like natural gas, which is still a fossil fuel. It is a little bit cleaner than coal, though, as well as renewable energy. And then we'll be working over the next couple years to update our greenhouse gas emissions inventories, and it'll definitely be interesting to look at 2020 and even 2021 as comparative years to what we saw before and how COVID-19 has impacted us right here. But Jeremy, I'll let you fill in more on that.
Yeah, it's such a good question, and it's such a good observation. I mean, we all had to stay home, right? And it makes so much sense that, like, all of a sudden, all those buildings, we assume that the power gets turned off. They don't. And in fact, in many ways, they still have to get heated. They still have to get cooled. The lights are on all 24 hours a day. So much of the building sector stayed relatively untouched simply because we have to keep those spaces. I say we have to. We don't, but we do. So that's a really good question, Patricia. But the one thing that we did learn in spades from this year was, by transforming the way that we were expected to move around, that had a enormous, however momentary, impact on carbon emissions. So we just published a paper about this, actually specific to Virginia. We had about a 7% decrease in our state's carbon emissions simply because of all the cars not being on the road. I mean, even that was relatively momentary. I was tracking, of course I was tracking traffic volumes from the VDOT data set that tracks traffic. I mean, you probably didn't know that they do that, but they do. And so we saw this huge decrease in this U shape of cars, starting in March, mid-March, and then the plateau of driverless roads was sometime in like mid-April last year. And then that slowly recovered, and we've been about 5 to 10% under normal since the fall. So I think if anything, it shows that, when required, which I don't advocate for, forcing people to stay home, in any way, but by transforming our transportation sector, which is actually our largest as a state, that's our largest carbon emission sector, is our transportation. By affecting change in the transportation system, that can have immediate effect on not only our carbon emissions, but other things like pollutants that disproportionately impact communities of color in the city of Richmond through the placement of the highway system. So there are really good cascading impacts by addressing, the ones that are a little bit easier to turn the knob on, more so than something like building energy use.
Awesome. Thanks, Jeremy. Who else has a question or a comment? we have a rule in our working groups that 7 seconds of silence means we're ready to move on. So I am going to implement that.
And that means that Jeremy's going to sing the Jeopardy song if somebody doesn't do something quickly.
I have a question.
Rebecca has a question. Go ahead, Rebecca.
My name's Rebecca Aaron Sidner. I'm a green building consultant here in town. And I had a question about the I think you're calling it an urban tree canopy master plan.
Are.
And I know Jeremy, the Science Museum, has been doing a lot with that. And so I was wondering, are you envisioning more collaboration between the city and the Science Museum, or kind of how do you envision that happening?
Yeah, so I think, Rebecca, just to make sure, you're referring to in our draft content, we have a strategy within the environment pathway about creating an urban forestry master plan. I'll actually say that all of the organizations represented by our panelists have played and are playing roles in expanding the city's tree canopy. That master plan concept is a strategy. It's a draft right now, and we don't have a ton of details within the draft, but I would definitely anticipate that it means more partnerships across the board. The critical pieces that we've heard from our working groups and the community on forming something like that strategy are that we need more resources, both internally at the city in terms of our urban forestry division, and just resources for tree planting in general. And then there's going to be a really key component around partnerships. So I'm wondering if Rob, Giles, Jeremy, any of you want to speak to some of the tree planting efforts that have been going on even just this year in our community.
Giles, you want to start and I'll follow?
Happy to. I would actually just like to plug that we did successfully get an AmeriCorps grant. We have 3 open positions right now at the Department of Forestry that's coming through the Parks Department, but these are paid positions and they are training oriented, and they have, we've been advertising them for a couple months. And so I understand that it's a strange time in the economy in terms of jobs. But anyway, there are 3 open positions if anyone is interested. And I might talk to you, Brianne, about getting the word out about that in your network. But in terms of tree plantings, it's interesting. I would just reflect that it's one of the issues is that DPW, Department of Public Works, and the Parks Department have a shared responsibility towards trees, but neither of the departments really has the resources to do what we're in charge to do in terms of planning for tree succession. So we've been working with the Richmond Tree Committee, or Reforest Richmond, on planting thousands of red buds, or at least getting them into a position where they're ready to plant. We just did a tree planting yesterday in Pleasant Park, which is, I think, probably a small heat island. I'm not sure what it looks like on Jeremy's map, but I would imagine it's a bright color. So anyway, we work with the community all the time to plant trees, but at this point, we really need help with creating an inventory. So we're working on a parks tree inventory, because that doesn't fall under Department of or the forestry division at the Department of Public Works. So we have a ways to go on our data, and we have a way in terms of how we address this issue, and in terms of getting folks into positions that are available. And that's why we couldn't do it without partners. Okay, I'll turn it over to Rob.
Yeah, so I'm gonna kind of go to the partnership side of this. The bad news is our tree canopy is not where it needs to be, and it needs to grow, and that's a piece that really has an impact on urban heat islands. The good news is that, again, in this moment, Reforest Richmond and a number of other initiatives, both at Parks City but broadly, are really looking at how do we get some more trees in the ground, right? And so We had through the Reforest Richmond, we got like 10,000 little baby red buds, right? And those went out to a lot of different places. We, at the back end of that, did Reforest RPS and put, hundreds of them in at RPS schools. Part of what has to happen as we think about resources for trees is we get them in the ground, but then if they don't get watered, then they die, right? And so we've seen that happen in a number of places. One of the things that Groundworkers doing is going out and watering trees, doing it on a fee-for-service basis, trying to attract private funds and foundation funds to do some of that stuff so that it's public-private partnership. And it's also a place of training and getting young folks connected to the whole process of the tree canopy, et cetera, et cetera. But I would say that in this moment, the partnerships that are coming together to get trees in the ground are robust compared to where they were even a year or two ago, and it feels like there's more coming down the pike. So there's a lot to do, but it feels like we're in better position than we might have been a minute ago. I was going to say something about data, but that's really Jeremy's thing.
Well, I was going to say, Jeremy, do you want to talk about, I know the Science Museum has been doing some things recently too, so feel free to add.
So I appreciate, Rebecca, the association between, the Science Museum and trees, because, I think it's really been the partnerships that Rob is talking about that has kind of elevated the reputation of the museum as being a tree place, and I think we've been really fortunate that we've gotten some funding to work with like the N Richmond Tree Lab to do this pedestrian pathway behind the museum that tries to connect us as part of a long-term city plan to connect Scott's Addition to the museum's campus. And then there's a long-term, starting in the fall, you will see the Science Museum's campus transform from a parking lot into a park. So there is going to be, and that's, got some real fertile ground, as it were, for even more of these partnerships to mature. And certainly as someone that does a lot of analysis of, various types of data sets, I would really love to figure out and contribute to the ongoing planning of this tree master plan. And I think if the museum can play any small role, we will. And certainly we've loved the partnerships that we've developed along the way.
Jeremy, that whole LiDAR thing that you all are so good at, we're going to ask you to sort of bring that to bear and help us figure out like because we've got a layer of that in, as we're looking at the Heat Island stuff, but there's more to go.
Have I shown you the most recent thing that I have? So we know, and this is just like a little storytelling bit. It's like, we know from the redlining study that we did that formerly redlined areas of Richmond have fewer trees. But did you know that they are physically shorter? They are smaller trees. So we were able to determine that from the LiDAR data. So now we have a classified tree layer. But the thing is that I wonder about its reliability necessarily on a very small scale. I can think about it as like the whole city is probably pretty reliable, or at the geography of a redlining polygon. But yeah, they're not only are there fewer trees, but they're smaller, and that's partially because of potentially the constraining amount of soil volume that they have. And they probably die, as you mentioned. As Cherie and the Southside Relief group would tell you, that and Virginia Community Voice, it's like they get planted and then die the year after, and then they get removed. And so they never have a chance to really mature.
And for anyone who's interested, at 6 o'clock, we're going to be starting our LiDAR happy hour. So stick around for that. Just kidding. All right. Any other questions or comments from folks? All right, I counted to 7. So my last question for everybody on the panel is, how are you celebrating Earth Day? Either something you did today to celebrate, you're doing tonight, maybe this weekend. Plug your events. Tell us what you're doing for Earth Day.
We're planting trees over at the new Sankofa orchard off of Midlothian Turnpike. Go to our website. You'll see a little poster. It's cool. It's a limited number of volunteers, though, so it's kind of first come, first serve. We don't want anybody to die of COVID. We're on our last legs. And then today, we turned over a 1/4 acre of soil at Hillside Court, where we're putting in a mini farm, supporting a young woman over there named Asia Good, who has this amazing vision of being able to grow food in the ground at Hillside. Boom, yes.
Awesome.
All right, Giles. So there's a few things. So first of all, I wanted to say that I was really fortunate this morning to participate in the unveiling of the John B. Carey Elementary School Eco Campus. The leadership of Michael Powell, the principal of JB Carey, has been unprecedented for an RPS principal. I think he called me out of the blue after he heard about the redlining study on NPR, called me in my office, and we helped to guide the planning, and along with the Alliance for the Chesapeake Bay, they got all this funding to plant all these native plants and make a rain garden. And I was able to participate in the unveiling of their eco campus and their No Child Left Inside program. And so that was, honestly, I got chills just thinking about it again, because I think that's going to be so powerful through time. And I think that we could replicate that at every RPS school, and certainly hope that that happens. But this weekend, really excited. You know, we've been able to, over the last year, create 2 new park spaces. One of them being an actual parks-owned parcel along Broad Street, across right at the Scott's Edition bus BRT stop, and nearby the Blanchards. And with the help of Giles and her workforce program, and the Richmond Community Tool Bank, and Richmond Foundation, and the Alliance for the Chesapeake Bay, we are kind of like working with PDR to integrate the kind of community and volunteer-driven vision of the park alongside their long-term vision for what it looks like, including a pedestrian plaza. So if you're around on Saturday morning, can't get a spot on Rob's tree planting at Sankofa, come by, pick up some coffee from Blanchard's, and hang out in a new park space on Broad Street.
And you can also see the plans that PDR has for that whole area, which is going to be a plaza. Totally big change for Cutshaw right there. And I will say Saturday afternoon is a big celebration of Earth Day at Belle Mead, where Groundwork has a really important presence. Belle Mead Recreation Center. There's going to be from 1 to 4. 1 o'clock is going to be an announcement about a Virginia Outdoor Foundation grant, a couple of them that went to Belle Mead. That site is just gorgeous this time of year. So there are going to be children's garden tours, and it's going to be kind of formal, I guess, with, the mayor and who knows who else. But anyway, the garden's looking beautiful, and it's a gorgeous park to bring your kids. And then Sunday, we're going to have a trash pickup in Bird Park. And tomorrow there are 2 community garden projects going on, but Parks and Rec has hosted events all throughout this week, a couple each day throughout James River Park System, community gardens, and in the parks north and south of the river. So we're rolling, and there's one going on right now, actually, at Uptown Community Garden. So anyway, it's been a beautiful Earth Week. And today, I just really enjoyed talking to community members about what they see in the parks, because people bring a lot of their dreams to these green spaces. So dream on.
Awesome. Perfect, Giles. I think those are our themes, are dream on. And as Rob said a couple times, we have a lot of work to do, but we're here to do it. So thank you all so much for your questions from the group who's attending today. Thank you, Jeremy, Rob, and Giles, for being here, being part of our working groups. We are not done with you. We have a lot more work to do on RVAgreen 2050, but we are at a critical point where, again, we're asking for the whole community's feedback. So I'm just going to wrap up with a couple quick things. our call to action. So for everyone who registered through Facebook or the Eventbrite for tonight's event, you should have seen that tonight's event was scheduled to be 5 to 6:30. We are purposefully ending our event as far as the discussion at 6 because we want you to take the next 30 minutes or so to provide your input on RVAgreen 2050 if you haven't already. So I'll give you the website in a second, but we have a couple of different ways that you can provide your input depending on how much time you have and the kinds of information you want to provide. All of this will be going back to the Office of Sustainability for us to compile and analyze and take back to our working groups and the Racial Equity and Environmental Justice Roundtable as we continue to work on this plan. So we have a document where you can see all of the draft content and put comments on it, as well as a couple of options for online surveys. One is a longer one that takes about 20 to 30 minutes, and the other one is just a quick one that takes about 10 minutes or so that asks you what your vision is for an equitable, climate resilient Richmond by 2030, and what projects you want to see in your community to get to that vision. So all of that is available on our website at rvagreen2050.com/participate. These options for providing input will be available through next Friday, April 30th. So please go ahead and do that tonight if you are willing to take the time and help us spread the word. You can follow us on any of the social media channels at RVAgreen 2050, as well as submit any questions, any kind of feedback you'd like to our email address, rvagreen@richmondgov.com. So that is all that I have for tonight's RVAgreen Gab. I'll stick around if anybody has any questions. But other than that, you are all free to go enjoy your Earth Day, and thank you so much for coming again. I'm going to stop the recording.
Thank you.